Tonight, the Civilands series continues with Chapter 2, Our Feast, Their Famine. I'm your host, Nicholas Austin. Welcome to Tuesday Night Fiction.
This sound will call with spirit true. I swear I'll hear that sound in you.
William Keagan sat at the head of the table staring down at nothing in particular, as was his typical habit whenever he wasn't speaking. What precisely he was staring at in these moments he knew to be the topic of endless debate from those who knew him. Perhaps they were curious because his contemplation was often accompanied by what they described to be an angry, snarling look on his face. A look that seemed to say the thing he was staring at was so repulsive to behold, William challenged its very existence. For those who dared to ask him about his habit, a group limited to his siblings, he had explained that he wasn't staring at any particular thing, nor was he angry. Yet for some reason, the curiosity of those around him persisted. Others had always told William that in many ways his personality was contradictory, and that itself fueled their interest. In fact, those who knew him best had frequently professed that they could not decide whether they preferred him to be calm or furious, as either tended to be unsettling. His brother Daniel had even once described him as a majestic, inviting volcano that could explode at any moment, or not explode at all. William found these opinions rather entertaining. The Keagan dining room was somewhat infamous for its decor. The table set so elegantly that a guest would temporarily forget that he or she was still in the heart of the chaotic Murrieta. William had done this intentionally, though admittedly somewhat ironically, as the Keagan mansion in the town of Fayette in which it was located was positioned almost directly in the center of the territory. Tonight, the people sharing his table all sat silently. When they had entered, William was pleased to see that they were dressed in a fashion that was as remarkable as the room, and for a moment, he thought that if they never spoke, they could have easily been confused for decoration. When the meal finally came and was served to the table, William chose to break his trance by passing a hand over his beard, which was trimmed just enough to be considered clean-cut without being overly proper. He then looked up, lifted his silverware, and declared with a calm smile, "My humble guests, let us begin our feast." In unison, his guests all followed suit, lifting their utensils and politely digging in. The entree was William's favorite meal, roast pig, a fact made obvious by the presence of the head of the animal on a large plate at the center of the table. William made sure that the display faced his seat at the head of the table. He felt it important that he always face the lives he had taken, whether directly or indirectly, believing he owed it to the fallen as a courtesy. To William's right, seated in a row, were the men of his closest inner circle. The man who had been by his side since the day he left for the Murrieta, Gregory Calloway, had the first seat. Gregory was a middle-aged, balding beast of a man who could break a person with his bare hands. He was a great ally and had been ever since, swearing his undying loyalty to William, who had saved his life in the past. It was an investment William never regretted. The next seat belonged to Daniel, the middle Keagan brother. All three brothers, separated in age by 3-year increments, had left their home in the east together with nothing, and now stood at the head of the most prominent gang in the Murrieta. Satisfaction filled William at the thought, before greed reminded him that they needed to further expand their influence into the final piece of the territory, the almighty North, to truly be all-powerful in the region. Daniel spoke to William about these things every day. He still raved at all they had achieved under William's leadership and about his own pride that he could help his brother oversee their trade routes. Of the three brothers, Daniel was the most socially aware and could convince most people to sell him everything they owned within the span of a short sit-down and chat. His good looks hadn't hurt in this regard either, as women back east had always ogled over his shiny smile and thick, well-maintained hair. Daniel always wore it slicked back, which William thought went well with his business-centered personality. Though William wondered whether occasional jealousy crept into Daniel's thoughts, William was extremely thankful to have a brother so loyal, and he knew he couldn't have made it so far without him. The next two seats sat empty, but typically were held by his youngest brother Clovis Keagan and his cousin Walter Keagan, respectively. Clovis was a clever, extremely animated young man who was a perfectionist with a depraved longing for violence. The combination of these traits made him quite the effective military mind, something William unrepentantly utilized in his strategy. As Clovis's 29th birthday was only a few months away, William had recently gifted him with the permission to lead their territorial expansion. Clovis thanked him sincerely and profusely for the freedom. Walter, who was himself 2 years younger than Clovis, was a thrill-seeker and common companion of Clovis's on his conquests. He was electrified by conflict, yet he prided himself on his politeness in conversation. The final two chairs along the right of the table belonged to William's 15-year-old cousins, Blanton and Donna Keagan, who were identical twins and Walter's younger siblings. The twins were constant companions, even at this late age, primarily because Donna had an odd social condition in which she could only speak as a follow-up to her twin brother. Unlike the rest of the family, who were tall and thin, the red-headed twins had not yet grown to their full height and were overweight, a fact that led them to be clumsy. Walter and the other Keagan brothers were defensive of them in the face of others, but that didn't stop William from finding most everything about them comical in his private mind. Walter's parents had not seen the humor in these characteristics, however. Instead, they had become entirely frustrated with the twins, which was what landed the twins in the care of their brother and cousins. "Who are our guests then, cousin?" Blanton asked William, indicating the people sitting to William's left and breaking the silence that had resumed at the table. "Yes, Billy. Who is this exquisite lady sitting beside you?" Donna echoed. William finished chewing and answered. "Well, children, these kind folks next to me are the Abigail family. This fair maiden to my left would be the lovely Judith Abigail." William watched as Judith blushed at his remark. The two had been introduced once previously, but William was pleased with her beauty, to say the least. She had long, silky hair in a reddish-brown color, which incidentally was his preferred coloring in a woman. Her figure took an hourglass shape, emphasized by her red corset and dress, which only intrigued him further. Sitting next to Judith is her father, Henry Abigail, then her mother, Maria Abigail, sisters, Henrietta and Florence Abigail, and finally her youngest sibling, her brother, Francis Abigail, he finished. "And, what business do the Abigail family have at our table?" Blanton followed up with a mouthful of food. "Now, Blanton, don't be rude," chirped Donna. William was pleased she had corrected him. "Hard to understand what you're trying to say with your mouth so stuffed. But there is no business here today, my boy, only pleasure." He looked back to Judith with a smile as he continued his lie. "This is the woman Walter and I told y'all about. The one I'm to marry, thanks to Mr. Abigail here." "Oh, no, William. The pleasure belongs to Miss Abigail and I," the father added politely. "You'll make a fine husband to our Judith." Mr. Abigail paused and took a bite of food before continuing. "Might I ask by the way of the whereabouts of your brother and cousin? I do hope they'll be able to attend the wedding in a few days." "That isn't none of your business, so no, you may not ask," Gregory coldly replied, staring directly at the now frozen Mr. Abigail. William trusted Daniel best to put people at ease and cut him a quick look. Daniel rested a hand on Gregory's arm and coolly corrected William's beast in response. "Gregory, please. Mr. Abigail, you're a guest in our home, and soon you'll be family here as well. You may ask whatever questions you'd like. Clovis and Walter are currently away on business in the north, trying to seek out new trade alliances for our family. They should be back in time for the wedding. You see, I coordinated their expedition, and I assure you that we planned it with every intention for that to be the case. They certainly didn't want to miss it either." Mr. Abigail's tense shoulders visibly relaxed again. "Well, who would?" Miss Abigail chimed in merrily. "In the Murrieta, we must take every opportunity for joy we receive, mustn't we?" William smiled. "Most certainly, Miss Maria. By the way, might I ask how you're enjoying the meal my chefs have prepared this evening?" First dabbing her lips with her napkin and chewing the remainder of what was in her mouth, she replied, "Oh, it's delicious, William. Send them my regards." "They must be the best in the Murrieta." "Oh, I'd say they certainly are, and if they weren't, they'd be replaced by the ones who were." He turned to Judith. "No expense will be spared for this angel's happiness. I can assure you of that. I don't believe there's a more charming face in all the West to face me at the end of my table every night." It was one of William's decided traditions, and he had thought up many, for his wife to sit at the opposite end of the table, at the other head, during meals, but only to do so once officially married. Judith continued to blush before replying, "Thank you, William. Your words are too kind." The group continued eating quietly for another few minutes. "So where are y'all from? Are you from the East like us?" Blanton again blurted out. "Of course they're from the East, only the native clans are actually from the Murrieta," Donna answered. Suddenly, young Francis looked up, his face suggesting that a light had just turned on in his mind. "Why are you doing that?" he asked, looking at Donna. She looked at him angrily, but did not say a word. "Francis, silence!" his father interrupted. William was not bothered, however. He knew Francis was too young to understand the social dynamic of not being a Keagan at the Keagan's table. "Father, I'm sorry, but I'm simply confused," he squeaked, too ignorant for his own good. "Why does she only speak after her brother speaks?" Donna's face was now nearly as red as her hair. "Don't you worry about it, little boy," Blanton said, showing Francis his size with his body language. William nearly chuckled out loud at the display. "You're so lucky my big brother Walter isn't here," Donna grumpily followed. "See?" Francis simultaneously replied, pointing at her. Henrietta and Florence giggled. "That's enough," Mr. Abigail yelled at his son. "I'm so sorry, William. He will learn the meaning of respect tonight, I can assure you of that." William looked toward Donna, who was now on the verge of tears. "Well, don't apologize, Mr. Abigail. I suspect you're right anyhow," he replied, sending a smile in Donna's direction. He gave her a wink that calmed her down, and she finally smiled back. "Now no more of this foolishness," William declared. "I'd like to propose a toast to my beautiful soon-to-be bride, and to our brothers beginning our venture in the north. May both journeys be prosperous, and may they lead to many more feasts such as the one we have devoured this evening." The group raised their glasses in unison before sitting back down and falling into silence again. Dessert would be coming out next. Until then, William opted to retreat back into his trance, his own mind being so much more interesting than the company. He stared down at his empty plate. Oh, to be a fly on the wall of the Keagan dining room. That's part 1. Let's move on to part 2 of 5. Soon after Chieftain Arcuda was shot in front of her and she'd watched his body fall back into the River White, Jeannie ceased resisting capture. She no longer contained the will to fight, not on this day when all she knew had seemingly vanished. What remained was nothing but smoldering timbers, blood, and kicked-up sand. Staring into the now murky water of the river, she numbly wondered what was next. As if in answer, the young men surrounding her yanked her forward, forcing her through the woods and back to the Vahani camp. She vaguely recognized that the councilmen, that's who she assumed they were anyway, being that they were with the chieftain, at least had the decency to walk her apart from the now hobbling Walter Keagan. One of them, who appeared younger and more aggressive than the others, lagged back to walk with her and the boys. "You and your family had seen them before today, had you not?" he asked, nodding toward Walter. Jeannie gave no reply, so he grunted and walked ahead again. But his question had brought up the memory, even if she was now unwilling to share it. And almost against her will, a day from a few weeks before, the day she'd first seen a Keagan, sprang up into her mind. Each Monday, her brother Harrison, who was the eldest of her 2 brothers and 5 years her senior, would go into town to trade supplies with the locals. Their father had made Harrison responsible for the route about 2 years prior. After receiving his parents' permission, Harrison decided to take her and their brother Donovan along with him one Monday, to introduce them to the role and what it entailed. Harrison's route cut through the town of Huron, which was part of the Riverlands and nearby to the Morel home. Huron was one of the few relatively safe communities in the Murrieta thanks to the consistent stream of goods running through it, and its mostly peaceful relations with the nearby Vahani, both of which were facilitated by their parents. Jeannie had always known her brother to take pride in his work, so she was unsurprised when he explained the process to her and Donovan with great enthusiasm. "The people around these parts rely heavily on our family, and it's our duty to deliver their needs each week," he began as he gathered his goods for the day. "I head into town and take requests for goods for the coming week, and then I deliver orders that were placed last week." "Do you ever have problems with bad people?" Donovan interrupted nervously. Jeannie hid her smile. Donovan wasn't quite as brave as Harrison yet, Not yet, Harrison said. But our father is well known and well liked around these parts, so I don't anticipate it happening. In case it does, though, he added with a slight hesitation, here's a pistol for each of you. We'll go back for some target practice before our run. Jeannie had never been allowed to shoot a pistol before, and she wondered whether Harrison had gotten permission for this too. They practiced shooting for an hour or so, pretending their targets were this criminal and that criminal. Throughout their session, Harrison provided them with tips on how to improve their accuracy until he decided it was time for them to go on their way. On their arrival into Haran, Harrison put Jeannie in charge of taking the next week's orders so that he and Donovan could focus on delivering the previously ordered goods. Both Jeannie and Donovan were able to meet several townspeople in the process, and on their way home, Jeannie asked Harrison about several characters that had piqued her interest. The first Jeannie asked about was Charles Langston, an oafish man who was the self-proclaimed mayor of Haran, which was unusual considering that Haran was not even a properly organized town. Harrison told her that at one point the man falsely claimed that the community elected him to the position at a local gathering and that he reported to governing forces outside the Murrieta. He was clearly delusional, Harrison told her, but since he seemed to be mostly well-intentioned, most people let him be, especially since his stories were entertaining no matter how untrue they seemed. Then, after a little prompting, Jeannie had cajoled Harrison to tell her about Cassie and Deborah Kennedale, the sisters who claimed to be joint psychics. To the shallow men in town, the sisters, who were each in their upper 30s, were not viewed as particularly attractive. Their faces were littered with freckles, they had awkward smiles that had intentionally hid crooked teeth, and their blonde hair seemed to fall from their heads more than it flowed. The younger of the two, by a few years, Deborah, took their lack of attention harder than the thick-skinned Cassie. However, it did not keep either of them from being extremely kind to those they cared about, and Harrison mentioned that their home was always a favorite stop of his. Harrison explained that they made a great living convincing men on their way through Haran that great fortunes awaited them in the Murrieta. Much to their amusement, the men whose futures they foresaw largely never returned to dispute them. Jeannie laughed when Harrison shared this, thinking the sisters terribly clever. The last townsperson Jeannie had wanted to know more about was Dominic Turner, and she made it clear that she was especially excited to hear what Harrison had to say about him. Mr. Turner had made a coin disappear and reappear before her eyes earlier that day when she was taking his order, and the man had fascinated Jeannie ever since. Just as Harrison was about to get into his story, however, a tall figure rode up to the siblings on horseback and interrupted him. Jeannie's first thought at the time had been that the man did not look like most people in town. Now she knew he was nothing like them. "Excuse me, children," he beckoned, his accent foreign to her. "If y'all could help me figure out where I am, I'd greatly appreciate it, seeing as I'm not from these parts. Would these be the Riverlands?" he asked, through a large, toothy smile. "That's right, sir," Harrison replied. "What's your business here?" "My business?" he asked. "Well, I have no business here yet, but I'd very much like to." There was a charm to him, Jeannie thought, but since out-of-towners were never to be trusted, she remained on guard at Harrison's lead. "Y'all children know how close we are to one Adonis Morel, as a matter of fact? I hear he's a man of great skill in these parts, who I'd very much like to talk to." Jeannie didn't like that this man was looking for their father. It wasn't unheard of course, for people to want to meet Adonis Morel, but this man was more a stranger than any who'd come before him. Jeannie took a close look at him then, noting his frilly clothes and in particular the garnish, gold lion's paw pin that was pinned to his coat. What an odd thing to wear. "Fairly close," Harrison finally answered uneasily. "Well, children, don't look so tense," he said in a far jollier tone than Jeannie had heard anyone in the Murrieta speak. "Y'all have been a great assistance. I'll be on my way now. Stay safe." He then turned his horse around and rode away with an alarming haste. There were no more stories of the townsfolk as she and her brothers headed straight home, unease skidding up their spines. If only she'd known what the lion's paw pin meant that day. If she had, she thought, her family might still be alive. Looking up, she realized they had made their way through the forest and nearly arrived at the camp, which was just ahead. On arrival, the men rushed her through the camp into a small building. Ordering her inside with a single guard, they had a muffled conversation that Jeannie couldn't hear outside before entering. The councilman who questioned her earlier approached her and coldly explained, "We know who you are and we will ensure your safety, but we need to hold you for a bit for our own protection against the Keagans. I am very sorry for what they did to your family." Don't lie, please, Jeannie muttered. I know you aren't sorry, and what you did was horrible. The councilman's face scrunched up for a few seconds. Did you and your family see them before today? He asked again. Yes, we did, but not the same ones who came today, she replied angrily. Why? What difference does it make? There's no way we could have known this was coming. That would be where you are wrong, child, he declared in a louder tone. I knew this was coming. I knew it, and I didn't even know who the Keagans were until a day ago. In fact, the Keagans were not even the catalyst of the thought. No, this was inevitable from the time you and your Easterners first came into our territory. Now look what has become of it. This is not just about the gangs and the murderous wanderers. The Morels are just as responsible for the position in which my people and I have been placed, for the decision I had to make. Don't you dare blame us for your cowardly decision, Jeannie roared back. Cowardly? My decision was anything but cowardly, he shouted, his face becoming flush, veins appearing in his forehead and neck. Once we have rooted you and your people out from our lands, it will be perfectly clear what we did was necessary to survive. With that, he turned and stormed out. The guard stood by the doorway in silence, and as much as Jeannie resented the councilman, and as much as she saw the truth about the greed of the Keagans, she couldn't help but wish that he could see the difference between her family and that cruel gang. Poor little Jeannie. That's part 2. Let's find out what's next. The pace of the current was beginning to pick up. Once Hansa knew he was out of sight of the councilman, he burst to the surface of the river and gasped for air. His arms flailed listlessly and soon grew heavy from fatigue as he was pushed down the rapids. He tried desperately to swim towards the edge of the stream, but the current was too strong. On an attempt to surface his head, he saw a tree branch hanging over the crashing water in the distance. It appeared to him to be just low enough to grab onto, and he merely hoped it was thick enough to hold his weight. He started swimming less to preserve his energy, steadily moving closer and closer until he was within striking distance. Once upon it, he used all his weight to jump upward out of the water, his right hand reaching for the branch. His hand landed, but the grip failed him. Too weak to compete against the thundering waters. He felt himself slipping until he held on to nothing and crashed back into the water. At the next turn, he was thrown against a rock. The sharp pain in his head was the last thing he felt before everything faded to black. Sometime later, Hansa opened his eyes. His vision was blurry and his head was pounding in pain, but he quickly realized he was no longer in the ice-cold river. Thankful he was now lying on the shore, he lifted his hand to his head, which he could feel was wrapped in cloth. With his awareness still returning and his body shivering violently, he recognized the presence of someone sitting beside him, carving away at an apple. Once he felt in control of his functions again, he jumped up and knocked the carving knife out of the man's hand. "Who are you?" he yelled as he backed away. "Where are we?" The man did not move in response, which gave Hansa the opportunity to look him over. This was a man of the East, and in a way that actually put Hansa at ease. After what had transpired earlier that morning, he was afraid he wouldn't be able to trust any of his own. Behind the man, Hansa spotted a horse tied to a post and some camping equipment hanging over the saddle. There were also several other items he did not recognize, so he returned his gaze to the man himself, who wore a curious-looking hat that covered his curly blonde hair. The man appeared to be dressed somewhat formally, yet his clothes, though well-to-do, were slightly worn down, and the very beginnings of a beard shadowed his face. He appeared to be about the age of Lennox, Hansa thought. The mysterious figure peered up at Hansa from underneath his hat. "Well, that there is my horse Nala," he replied. "As for me, I'm a man that saw a boy struggling in the water. I followed that boy and recognized that he needed saving, so I saved him." "Who are you? And how does a young Vahani fall into the River White at this time of year?" "I did not fall, I jumped," Hansa replied defensively. "Thank you, though. Thank you for saving my life. What can I do to repay you?" "Well, I'm pretty sure there's nothing you could do to repay me for saving your life, but I have been wrong before. Anyway, you can start by handing me my knife up off the ground, so I can continue enjoying this apple," he answered. Hansa could tell the man was much less simple than his demeanor suggested, but he said nothing. Instead, he lifted the knife and handed it over. The man got back to work on the apple and said, "Thank you. Now you can tell me who you are and why you jumped into the River White." "My name is Hansa. My people..." He trailed off, struggling to retell the tale, struggling to even comprehend that his father, the great Arcuda, was dead. The man rested his knife and looked up, prompting him to continue. Hansa thought to start with what was clear to him first. "There is a very real danger coming to the north," Hansa said. "A young Tokali came to warn us of them. Then we chanced upon some of them by the river while we were on a hunt. My father is..." He paused, his voice having broken on the last word. "What was the chieftain? His councilman wanted to join the Tokali to stop them. He only wanted to do what was best for his people, but I believe the councilman saw an opportunity to achieve their own goals, and so they killed him. They must have been planning it. Somehow, I escaped." The Easterner took a breath, staring right ahead for a moment, before looking at him. "I'm sorry, son. That all sounds horrible. But did you say your father was Chieftain Arcuda?" Hansa nodded. "I knew of him. He seemed an honorable man from what I had heard." The man paused and looked back up, with fire in his eyes. "When you say them, you're speaking of the Keagans, aren't you?" "What do you know of the Keagans?" Hansa asked with sudden alarm. "Don't worry yourself," he replied. "I'm certainly not a friend of theirs. They're the reason I'm on my current path. It was my intention to leave the Riverlands and possibly the Murrieta altogether. They came up here and did unspeakable things to my town. So, I gathered a few essentials and left the rest behind," he said sadly. "We were a tight-knit community in Huron. It's one of the few homes I've ever had where I felt truly accepted. There simply isn't a place with as many quality people in the Murrieta or anywhere for that matter. Those bastard Keagans came and burned down the house of the very people that held it all together for us. Very generous they were. Unfortunately, I heard none survived." Hansa felt puzzled at first, but began connecting the pieces. "Are you from the same town as Jeannie Morel?" he asked. The man beamed. "Yes, Huron. Did you know Jeannie well?" he asked excitedly. "I knew her before, yes, but I have also seen her today. She is alive." Hansa smiled briefly. "But my people have her as well. I suppose her to be very valuable." "Jeannie's alive? My goodness, that is great news, Hansa," the man exclaimed. "The entire Morel family is invaluable to the Riverlands, and I in particular owe them my life. You see, when I first decided it was time to leave the east of Darija and cross the Charisma River into the Murrieta, I was excited, but terrified. Then I got here and I discovered how right I was to be afraid. Crossing in was obviously hell, but finding peace once I made it through was also a challenge. Gangs were everywhere then, and like many others, I unfortunately found myself a part of one. Simply to be around people to keep me safe. For a while that's all it was, but soon our gang grew, and its leaders became greedy. They started asking things of us we weren't comfortable with, and eventually they wanted me to kill a man in a rival gang. To that point, they kept me safe. So I didn't know what to do. His eyes widened through his story, and now the man paused to crack his knuckles. "Did you end up doing it?" Hansa asked reluctantly, feeling for the man's situation. Doing what?" The man shot back, still cracking away one by one. Did you end up killing the man?" Hansa followed, now on edge due to the man's odd reaction. The man looked startled for a moment and then glanced away as he continued. "I suppose I had no other option at the time, or at least that's what I told myself. When I pulled that trigger, something happened to me though. To this day, I'm not sure what to make of it. But all I knew at the time was I needed to escape that life. So I did. I ran away from there and eventually I came upon the Riverlands, into these very woods in which we now sit. For some time I was alone and suffering from guilt. I was on the verge of giving up, when one day, while scrounging for food, one of your bears came upon me. I was as terrified as I'd ever been, but at that point I'd accepted my fate. That's when Jeannie's father Adonis appeared out of the woods and stood in front of that bear as fearlessly as I've ever seen a man be. He couldn't speak to that beast like you natives can, but Adonis had such regard for others that it didn't stop him from protecting me. That brand of goodness is not natural even in the best of men. I imagined his relationship with your people must have been a good one too, because some of yours came around and sent that grizzly along. From there, he introduced me to Huron and its community, which, like I said, was truly a home for me. Now, I don't know Jeannie as well as Adonis, but if she's alive, I owe it to him to ensure her safety. The same way he ensured mine for so many years. He paused and then looked at Hansa with ferocity in his eyes. You must lead me to your camp so we can retrieve her, he demanded. As it turns out, I was wrong about you. You were wondering how you could repay me for saving your life. Well, this is it. Hansa was horrified at the thought of going back, but he knew he had to try to save his sister before traveling north to his Uncle Oren in the mountain lands. He was going to make the journey his father had suggested. He was going to warn his people. You have a deal, he said, but I will only return there on one condition. My sister is there as well, and we must rescue her too if we can rescue Jeannie Morel. The man nodded. Fair enough, my young friend. Lead the way to your camp and we'll set them both free. The man stood, but Hansa remained unmoved until he sent a questioning look his way. You must tell me your name, stranger, before we travel together. The man smiled. Yes, of course. Dominic Turner, at your service. So who is Dominic Turner? Let's keep reading, maybe we'll find out, huh? Part 4, let's go. Following the feast, William anxiously paced the halls. He wanted some time alone with his future wife. There were things he needed to say to her, and her alone. Now retired to her room, she was surely tired from the journey into the Murrieta. Though her family had been safely escorted in for the purpose of the marriage, William knew from experience that the trip was long and much more dangerous than what people from the east were used to, especially wealthy people like the Abigail family. After some time of wandering the halls in procrastination, he finally composed himself and came to her door, where he delivered 3 knocks. Who is it? She called. It's your future husband, my dear, William quietly answered. May I have a moment of your time? Of course, he heard her reply after an initial hesitation. As he opened the door to walk into her room, Blanton and Donna ran behind him, chasing a screaming Francis down the hall. The young boy had a tin bucket on his head, courtesy of the twins, who followed behind him wielding wooden spatulas they were using to bang on it. William worried slightly that Judith wouldn't appreciate her brother being teased, though he was pleased to see his cousins defending each other. Taking a step toward her after chuckling briefly at the children, he slicked back his greasy chin-length hair. You know, if everyone were to agree on a mutual sense of humor, I'm certain all strife in the world would be cured shortly thereafter. A tiny grin cracked through her face as she gave him a nod. Then, looking downward, he continued. Anyhow, I plan to be brief, my lady. I just wanted to say that I'm very grateful that you're here. I don't know what you've heard of my family or the Murrieta or me. He stepped closer to her and his eyes moved upward to look into hers. Whatever you've heard, though, I will never hurt you. I will never let anyone else hurt you. And you will know all the wealth this land has to offer. She paused. He nearly held his breath waiting for her response, still uncomfortable around a woman like her. When she looked back at him, it was with a squint. May I be frank, William? Startled by her unexpected response, he said, Yes, of course. Please. Well, I would like to know how ambitious you are, she started. I come from great wealth and excitement in the East, and I hope I didn't come all this way into this strange place for less than I had before. William remained speechless as he processed the directness the likes of which he would have never expected from such a beautiful, seemingly proper woman. Apparently he took too long to reply because she continued. My family has been provided with a great chauffeur named Cassius on our journey who's been tasked to remain with us. If you can't give me the lifestyle I desire here, then please just tell me now, and I will take him back with us immediately. William snorted, and his laugh transformed into a dark grin he could feel spread across his entire face. My lady, I didn't expect such honesty. I assure you that you're exactly where you need to be for wealth and excitement. The Murrieta is a wild place. This mansion you reside in, the feasts you enjoy, these are only the beginnings of the riches I'll acquire in these golden lands. With that, she edged slowly closer to him, admitting an air of arousal that was certainly mutual. "Well, then I want you to show me. I do not wish to be the trophy at your table, but the voice in your ear and the woman by your side. If there is carnage, I want to see it. If there is gold, I want to hold it. If there is power, I want to fucking wield it. Can you promise me that will be the case?" "Well, shoot. You got a mouth on you or what? There's a fire in you that I'd very much like to see burn. Let me ask you something, though. Do you know why you're truly here, Judith?" William asked, thinking he might have a better way to answer her question. Their eyes locked. "I'm here to marry you," she answered. "Likely for appearances with those with which you do business. Also, perhaps, for pleasure and offspring." "You're close," he said, waving a finger at her and feeling a growing admiration for her sharpness. "That's certainly part of the reason, and will be an asset as I expand my influence here in the Murrieta. I also have very much wanted children of my own. But please, give me some credit, my darling. I think on a scale much larger than most men. Now why are you here? I'll give you a hint and tell you that your family has a role to play in this." She tilted her pretty head, which made her wavy hair fall gracefully to one side. Taking a moment, she added, "Well, my father has influence back east. He could provide connections there as well." Affirming her answer with an animated nod, William continued, "Yes? And who did your father previously work for back east?" Her eyes widened and she beamed. "Your father? This is about your father," she replied. Judith would have been well aware of William's father, Leonard Keagan. Anyone back east would. "That is correct," William said solemnly. "My father was surely the one who found y'all that chauffeur of yours as well, wasn't he? Cassius brought y'all here safely over the Charisma and through Prayer's Passage, and remains here to ensure that safety continues. I believe this shows my father clearly places great value on Mr. Abigail, despite the fact that he left the East for the opportunity I offered him here. Your father's one of the few men fortunate enough to have Leonard Keagan's ear. I was never so lucky. He deemed this place untamable, and I think he considered me the same way. I will prove him wrong, though. Once I take the mountain lands, I'll have access to more than just riches. We've received word that the Vahani fortress is not just for their defense from the south. It also serves as a barrier on the Murrieta side of the only land bridge connecting this land to the east. Because the bridge is so far north and because no Easterners to see it have ever returned to tell of it, it's entirely unknown to them. When we take the fortress, we'll open it up, and there will finally be a safer way to the Murrieta during the summer months. A way far better than crossing the Charisma and traveling through Prayer's Passage, that's for damn sure. If your father becomes an advocate for the work we're doing here, then I believe I can connect the Murrieta with the East. At that point, I'd have enough power to tame even the passage. The great eastern cities in this territory will no longer be separate entities. A partnership with my father would result in the largest conglomerate this continent has ever fucking seen. He paused, stepping up to her, and their bodies nearly brushed. You want wealth and excitement, Judith. My lady, I don't mean to be rude, but you haven't even begun to understand what those words can mean yet. Well, William Keagan, Judith whispered sensually as she began slowly removing pieces of clothing. You have intrigued me. I can promise you I am more than ready to be the best wife I can be for you. Now show me what those words mean. By the time she was fully revealed, William had closed the small distance remaining between them and slowly wrapped her in his arms. This woman was like nothing he had ever seen, and she was his. Soon it would all be his, but in that moment, the rest didn't quite matter as much to him. As she had accepted his advance, he pressed his lips against hers and the flame was ignited. In no time at all, the two found themselves tangled in one another. Though he wasn't a virgin, that night was the first time in his life that William Keagan truly made love. Part 5. The final section. Night fell over the Vahani camp. The atmosphere was very different than it had been just days before. Latera knew she should be with the members of the clan preparing for the outcome of the council meeting, but she'd been in tears and immobile since Lennox delivered the news. Her father, dead. Her brother, dead. All at the hands of that damned, wretched Keagan gang. A part of her, the small part that could spare any thoughts beyond her grief, wondered at the reason that little Jeannie Morell was being watched over by a guard when she was suffering Latera's same loss. Her family dead not even a day. But right now, Latera couldn't make it matter. Almost as soon as Elon had opened her up to the possibility of immersing herself in the larger world, in another clan culture, in a united native world, losing her family had destroyed those dreams. She didn't care anymore. Her typically braided hair was a mess, and she couldn't even work herself up to fixing it. So she lay there for hours in her sorrow. That evening, however, she decided to gather what strength she did have to join her people, and hear what the councilman's next step would be. Since his return, Lennox insisted she be accompanied by a guard, who he assured her was there to provide anything she asked for. She tried to tell him it wasn't necessary, but her protests were to no avail. When the councilman finally emerged, the Vahani were all waiting and eager to hear the determination. Parrish emerged first, followed by Castor, and finally Lennox.
Vahani!
Parrish began.
After much deliberation, the bravery of Lennox in his attempt to save our lost chieftain Arcuda, and his strength in the capture of the monster, Walter Keagan, have led the council to name him our new chieftain. May Chieftain Lennox lead us to glory!
Then the new chieftain Lennox approached the mass of his people in their whites, flanked by Parrish and Castor. With their faces lit by the fire, he began.
My people, in our cell sits Walter Keagan. He is an awful man who, as you know, has killed our fearless leader and his brave son, he furiously declared to grumblings from the group. Elon was then brought to the chieftain's side. This is the Tokali we have taken in, Elon,
Lennox said.
He lives and breathes in our camp because we must unite. We must eliminate the threat of the wretched Easterners who create havoc in our lands. The Vahani and the Tokali must become one to defend our territory.
The group gave a cheer of approval to their new chieftain.
The Keagans are violent and terrible,
Elon added.
My people and I are enthralled by your decision to stand with us against their tyranny. I now ask you to march south so that we may combine our forces.
Lennox built off of Elon's support.
It is decided by this council that we will march south. We will bring this Keagan prisoner as a hostage, and alongside the Tokali we will rid the territory of these greedy outsiders.
Latera could see that the Vahani, warriors and civilians alike, were ready to stand with their new leader, and in a way she was pleased. She thought that perhaps Lennox was carrying out a decision her father would have made. Lennox raised his hand for silence.
As always, if there are any dissenting opinions from the people of the Riverlands, please let them be stated.
He gave the customary pause and scanned the crowd. Suddenly, Latera heard a pop in the distance from the forest. A light traveled higher and higher into the air as the entire crowd turned and looked on in confusion. The silence was broken when a great explosion burst and filled the sky. Panic and unrest filled the camp as the fire that woke the night took the form of a lion's paw. As the image filled Latera's eyes, she began to tremble. The symbol of her loved one's killers made her feel weak. Her mind began to race in all directions, and her heart was beating out of her chest. She fell to her knees and began crying loudly again. In the commotion, Lennox furiously called out,
Men, take positions! Women and children, to your homes!
The guard by Latera's side tried to encourage her to follow him back to her home, but she remained on the ground. Lennox rushed over to her and then turned to the guard.
Get her there now, he demanded. I want 5 other men with you as well. Protect her at all costs.
Amid the commotion, Elon ran over. I will go with them, he stated. Latera, come with us. You are going to be all right. She remained in a kind of shock, but acknowledged his promise and was able to snap to her feet. Elon put his arm around her shoulder, and she followed him along. In the madness, Latera could see the warriors of the camp had assembled and prepared for the coming threat. They waited for the Keagan force to rear its head and rush from the trees, but rather than a group of attackers, more pops and explosions began to fill the sky. She became taken by the colors of each burst. Never had she seen anything like it, and despite her panicked state, she felt as if there were explosions occurring inside her, too. Ones that were reshaping her and who she was in her entirety. When they had reached Latera's home, she peered at an opening to see what was going on. By now she was sure an attack would engulf them in flames. But after about 5 minutes of explosion and anticipation, it became obvious that an attack was not coming. At least not from the trees. Surely this had to be a diversion. But something still didn't feel right. In a booming voice, Lennox called out to his men. "First wave! Go into the trees and get to the bottom of this. Second wave, follow closely behind. I need a group of you with me." With that, off he went. Then Latera heard a roaring coming from the woods. She assumed at first that the men were calling the grizzlies, but then she could make out from the distance that a single grizzly was standing against the Vahani. It did not appear to be fighting, but rather acting wildly. Suddenly, Elon gently pulled her away from her viewing point. "Please do not worry yourself, Latera," he said. "We will stop them. I will not let them hurt you, I promise." There was so much going on that didn't make sense to her, but Latera appreciated his bravery anyway. Not long after the noise began to subside, Lennox rushed in past the guards at the door. "Are you alright, Latera?" he asked, seeming extremely flustered. "Yes, I am fine. But what happened out there?" Lennox seemed to ignore her, looking straight at Elon, who was still by her side. "So there was no trouble here then? No disturbances of any kind?" Lennox questioned. Elon shook his head. "Nothing at all," he replied, to which the other guards confirmed. Lennox looked away for a moment. "All right. Yes, that's good to hear," he said. Then he turned back to Latera. "It is no major threat for now. The only mishap was that the guard watching the Morel girl was incapacitated, and she is nowhere to be found. Otherwise, there were no issues to worry about. The Keagans seemed to truly want her, so they must have come and snatched her up. We were able to secure Walter Keagan, though, and there was no loss of life, so we simply must act promptly now that this has passed." "And what of the bear?" Latera added. "Seems it was startled by the noise or something initially, but it ran off. And again, no one was harmed," he said quickly. "We must return to the fire and regroup with everyone now." With that, they followed him out. Once the Vahani were all back together, he explained the same story he had to Latera. "Despite what happened, the Morel girl is not our priority by any means. And with Walter Keagan in our grasp, they are still at our mercy," Lennox added. "As we were saying before, and now what is twice as clear is that the time to act is now. People of the Riverlands, prepare yourselves, for tonight we travel towards unity." With that, they all nervously cheered and readied. Latera felt their fears, doubts, and hopes. However, that night had planted a seed inside her, which she had never felt before. Losing her family and seeing her people in disarray made her realize that she was truly in this now, and that she would no longer simply allow herself to be at the mercy of the current. Well, that'll do it for Chapter 2. I just wanted to thank you all so much for listening, and look forward to next week when we talk through what happened here and my thoughts. As always, feel free to like, share, and subscribe as much as possible. I'd really appreciate it. And if you have read the books, please go on to Amazon and leave a review if you did enjoy them. Also, as mentioned last week, the free book giveaway for the first 3 books in the Civilands series, as well as a copy of Ready Player One, will continue. That's going to go through probably like the first 6 episodes, so through Chapter 3 of the series. And if you share the podcast, that's how you become eligible. One lucky winner who shares and tags me on any of my social media will win all those books. The Civilands series will be signed by me. Ready Player One will not, for obvious reasons. But look forward to seeing you on social media and seeing those tags, and good luck winning all the books. Just wanted to say again, for those listening in, welcome to the Civil Gang. We have about 52 chapters written and unwritten of the Civilands series, so this is going to be a long time going on this podcast. It's going to be a long ride, and I'm glad to have you aboard. So, till then, this has been Nicholas Austin. This is Tuesday Night Fiction, and I'll talk to you again soon. Happy Tuesday.
The sound will call.
The Tuesday Night Fiction podcast, the Civilands series, and the musical score for the podcast are all produced by More Bell Productions.